In the winter of 1944, an SS Panzergrenadier officer named Werner Kortenhaus sat down and wrote a single sentence in his field journal. He had just survived contact with American paratroopers outside Bastogne. The sentence read, "We were not fighting men. We were fighting something that had decided not to die." He was not being poetic, he was being precise. Kortenhaus had served on the Eastern Front. He had fought Soviet troops at Kursk, where the ground itself seemed to bleed. He had held lines against British soldiers who attacked with mechanical, almost bureaucratic stubbornness. He had seen things that qualified men as having seen everything. And yet somewhere in the frozen Ardennes something happened to him that none of those experiences had prepared him for. He encountered the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army, and it changed what he believed was possible for human beings to endure. This is not a story about heroism the way Hollywood tells it. Hollywood gives you slow-motion flags and swelling orchestras. This is something quieter and more disturbing. This is the account of what happened when the most elite ground assault force in the Wehrmacht, the SS, came into sustained contact with American paratroopers who had no orders to retreat, no obvious way to survive, and no apparent awareness that what they were doing was supposed to be impossible. The story begins not with glory. It begins with cold, with hunger, with paratroopers jumping into darkness over Nazi-occupied Europe, carrying everything they needed to survive on their backs, knowing that if the drop went wrong, there would be no one coming to get them. And it ends with German officers, men trained from childhood to believe in absolute Aryan military superiority, writing reports in which they struggled to find language adequate to describe what the Americans had done to them. The 101st Airborne Division was activated in August of 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The Army took young Americans from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, fishing towns in Maine, and steel mill towns in Pennsylvania, and it broke them down to nothing. Then it built them back up into something the world had never quite seen before. The training was not training in any conventional sense. It was closer to a systematic program of controlled suffering, designed to locate the absolute limit of human endurance and then push men 6 inches past it. But the physical demands were secondary to the psychological ones. What the Army was trying to build was not a physically superior soldier. What the Army was trying to build was a soldier who, when everything went wrong, when the drop was scattered, when the objective was lost, when the radio was dead, and the nearest friendly unit was 12 miles away and the enemy was everywhere, would look at that situation and decide it was still manageable, would decide there was still a way, would decide to keep moving forward. General William Lee, the father of American airborne forces, described what he was looking for in these terms. "Give me men who understand that the word surrounded simply means the enemy is now in range in all directions." That sounds like a joke. It was not a joke. It was an operational philosophy. And it was precisely this philosophy that the SS encountered in the Ardennes in December of 1944. To understand what happened at Bastogne, you need to understand what the Germans thought they were doing when they launched Operation Wacht am Rhein on December 16th. The Wehrmacht High Command, at Hitler's insistence, had devised a plan to punch through the thinly held Ardennes sector, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, and force a negotiated peace. The plan depended on speed, on shock, on moving faster than the Allies could react. In the first 48 hours it almost worked. The German assault hit American lines with devastating force. 3 SS Panzer divisions tore through sectors held by inexperienced units, or exhausted divisions pulled back for rest. Entire units were overrun or captured. The fog of war was total, and into this chaos the Allied command made the decision that would define the battle. They called the Screaming Eagles. The 101st Airborne Division was resting and refitting in Reims, France. They had just come off intense combat in the Netherlands during Market Garden, a campaign that had pushed them beyond what most military planners would have considered sustainable. They needed rest. They needed resupply. They needed time. They got about 18 hours. On December 17th, the order came down. The 101st was going to Bastogne. The paratroopers climbed into trucks. Most had no winter gear. The temperatures were already dropping below 0 Celsius. Many men were riding in open vehicles wearing their standard field uniforms. Some hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. They drove through the night toward the sound of a battle that was already going badly. And as they drove, they passed American units streaming back in the opposite direction. Combat veterans. Men who had been in the fight. Men who had seen what was coming. And those retreating soldiers shouted warnings. They told the paratroopers the Germans had tanks. They told them the SS was coming. They told them it was over. The Screaming Eagles listened to all of this, and kept driving toward the guns. The perimeter they were asked to hold was roughly 50 kilometers in circumference. They had approximately 15,000 men, many of them support troops rather than frontline infantry. Limited ammunition. Almost no artillery shells. Inadequate medical supplies. No winter clothing. The temperature dropped to -20 Celsius. The forest floor froze hard as concrete. Wounded men who lay still for more than a few minutes began to die from exposure. The Germans surrounding them had 5 divisions. Armored units, artillery, superior numbers in every category that is supposed to determine the outcome of military engagements. The encirclement was completed on December 21st. The Screaming Eagles were alone. On December 22nd, the German commander, General Lieutenant Heinrich von Luttwitz, sent officers under a white flag to the American lines carrying a formal ultimatum. It demanded the immediate surrender of Bastogne. It warned that continued resistance would result in the complete annihilation of American forces. The acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the ultimatum. His staff watched him, waiting to see how he would respond. He said, "Nuts." His staff asked him what he wanted to put in the written reply. He said to use that, just that. The formal American reply read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." They asked the American officer who delivered the note what the word meant. He told them it was the equivalent of "go to hell." They carried the message back, and the SS divisions around Bastogne began to attack. The assaults were not probing operations. They were full-scale attacks with armor and infantry, designed to crack the American lines and force either a capitulation or a rout. The Germans used their tanks as battering rams, expecting the paratroopers in their frozen holes to break. They did not break. Major Herbert Bucks, a Wehrmacht operations officer attached to the siege force, wrote in his after-action report, "The American parachutists defended every position as though retreat had been struck from their vocabulary. We took ground only at costs that made the ground worthless." This is an extraordinary sentence from a professional military officer. He is not praising the enemy out of sentiment. He is describing a tactical reality that was destroying his planning assumptions. The Germans had calculated rates of advance based on what infantry typically does when confronted with overwhelming armored force. What infantry typically does is give ground. The men of the 101st were not doing that. SS Unterscharführer Klaus Rademacher, who survived an engagement on December 23rd in which his unit lost 2 tanks and failed to take an American position held by approximately 80 men, wrote to his family from a field hospital, "They are not fighting from a foxhole. They are fighting from inside themselves. There is something wrong with them, something that makes them more dangerous than any soldier I have encountered." He was wounded by a grenade fragment, but the tone of his letter is not the tone of a man describing something he did not have a prior category for. There are individual men whose stories run through the larger narrative of Bastogne like veins through stone. Sergeant Leighton Black was a 22-year-old from Harlan County, Kentucky. He was a combat medic with the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. On the night of December 23rd, his aid station came under direct SS assault. The Germans were attempting to overrun a position that included wounded men who could not be moved. Black, armed with a pistol and a carbine that belonged to a wounded soldier, held the entrance to the aid station for an estimated 40 minutes while reinforcements were summoned. When those reinforcements arrived, they found 3 dead German soldiers at the threshold, and Black still standing, a bayonet wound in his left arm that he had not reported. His commanding officer recommended him for the Silver Star. Black said, in the understated manner of men from Harlan County, that he had been too busy to leave. Private First Class Vernon Hort from Columbus, Ohio, was a machine gunner with the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. On Christmas Eve, his position came under attack from a German armored column. A Panzer IV, 40 tons of steel moving through the dark. Hort's machine gun could not penetrate tank armor. He knew this. Every soldier knew this. When a tank comes for a machine gun position, the crew has 2 options: relocate or stay. Hort stayed. He fired on the infantry behind the tank, breaking the assault's cohesion, buying time for a bazooka team to reposition. The tank's main gun fired twice in his direction. The second round threw him several meters. He got up, he found his gun. He kept firing. The attack was eventually repelled. When asked years later why he had not retreated when the tank came, Hort said something that has the ring of complete simplicity and complete truth. He said, "That was my gun, those were my guys. What else was I going to do? What else was I going to do?" It is not a heroic statement, it is the statement of a man who had genuinely reorganized his priorities so thoroughly that retreating from his position had ceased to be a real option in his mind. He wasn't being brave in the way we use the word when we want to make courage sound like a gift rather than a choice. He had made a prior decision that he was not going to be the person who left his gun when the tank came. The Germans encountered this again and again, not one soldier making a dramatic stand. An entire division full of men who had made, each individually, that same prior decision. One of the most analytically interesting German accounts comes from SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Dinser, a senior staff officer with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. Das Reich had fought at Kursk, in France in 1940, in the Soviet Union for 3 consecutive years. Its officer corps had an average of 3 years of combat experience. Dins wrote a tactical assessment in January of 1945 that was captured by Allied forces and later analyzed by the U.S. Army War College. The document focuses not on American material superiority, not on Allied air power, not on ammunition or supply. It focuses on what Dins calls psychologische Immovabilität, psychological immovability. He writes that the American paratroopers demonstrated a capacity for holding defensive positions that exceeded anything observed in Soviet, British, or other American units. He attributes this to what he describes as a fundamentally different relationship between the individual soldier and the concept of retreat. He writes, "The American parachute soldier appears to have been conditioned to treat the abandonment of a position as a form of personal failure rather than a tactical option. This creates defensive cohesion that is nearly impossible to break through conventional assault methods." An SS officer writing a serious tactical document telling his superiors that the reason they couldn't break the 101st at Bastogne was not firepower, it was psychology. He was right. And the psychology he was describing was not accidental, it was manufactured. It was what happened when you eliminated, systematically, the men who would choose to stop when things became impossible. Christmas Day 1944, -22°C inside the Bastogne perimeter. The men of the 101st had been fighting continuously for more than a week. Ammunition desperately low. Wounded men who needed surgery receiving field dressings and prayer because there was nothing else available. And the Germans attacked again. 5 SS divisions launched a coordinated assault on the American perimeter in the pre-dawn hours. The assault achieved a brief penetration. German tanks actually entered the town of Chance on the western edge of the perimeter before being stopped. The fighting was room to room, building to building. American soldiers who had been in their positions for 8 days without relief, in temperatures that were injuring them as surely as the enemy, fought through the streets with rifles and grenades and, in several documented instances, entrenching tools. Obersturmführer Hans Menges, a tank commander with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, wrote in his logbook on the afternoon of December 25th, "We gained 300 meters this morning. We lost 47 men taking them." The Americans recaptured the meters by nightfall. I have no words for what these men are. When the army compiled its after-action analysis of the Bastogne campaign, it collected German testimonials and documents related to the performance of American units. The collection regarding the 101st was larger and more emphatic than anything gathered regarding any other American formation in the theater. SS Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Holzer, a company commander with the 12th SS Panzer Division who had fought at Kharkov, wrote after the battle, "In 12 months of combat on the Eastern Front, I never encountered troops who made me question whether we could win. After Bastogne, I questioned it every day." Captain Hans Vogelsang, a Wehrmacht artillery officer who supported the SS operations, wrote in his memoir published in West Germany in 1958, "We had a phrase on the Eastern Front. We said that a position was Amerikanisch verteidigt, defended like an American, when a position was held past the point of rational military logic. We did not mean it as a compliment when we coined the phrase. By the time I came home from the Ardennes, I was no longer certain it wasn't one. Amerikanisch verteidigt, defended like an American. A phrase that began as a condescension and became, in the mouths of men who had survived contact with the 101st, the highest professional praise they knew how to offer. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Luttwitz, the same officer who sent the surrender ultimatum, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "I have been asked many times why we did not take Bastogne. The honest answer is that we did not take it because the men defending it had decided that they would not allow it to be taken. And I had no operational response to that decision. It is the most devastating sentence a military commander can write. It means, I brought everything the doctrine says should work. And it did not work, because my opponent had chosen an option that the doctrine does not account for." The 101st Airborne Division came out of the Ardennes campaign with 19,000 casualties, killed, wounded and missing. What it had gone through was not a battle, it was an extended experiment in the absolute edge of human military endurance. And the edge turned out to be further out than anyone, including the Germans, had believed it was. Werner Kortenhaus, the SS officer who began this story, survived the war. He was taken prisoner in April of 1945, held for 18 months, and then released into a Germany that was trying to figure out what it was now. He eventually wrote a memoir, privately published in 1961, that covers his service from France through the Ardennes. The chapter on the Bastogne period is the longest in the book. It is almost 3 times the length of any other chapter. Near the end of it, he writes about a specific night in December, when his unit was assigned to assault an American position in the forest south of Bastogne. He writes about the approach through the trees, the snow that muffled sound so completely that the assault formed up almost in silence. He writes about the moment the American positions opened fire. He writes, "They fired as if they had been waiting for precisely us, at precisely that moment, as if they had decided before we came that they were going to stay, and they were going to hold, and they were not going to let us through. And we came at them with everything we had, and they did not let us through. I had been fighting for 4 years at that point. I had never had the experience of attacking a position and feeling, not fearing but feeling with certainty, that the men holding it were not going to move. That feeling was new to me. I have not found adequate language for it in the years since. He pauses in the text. Then, what those men were, I cannot say in military terms. What they were, they were. What they were, they were. It is not a sophisticated sentence. It is the kind of sentence you write when you have spent 17 years trying to say something correctly, and you have finally accepted that language is not going to do it. When all you have left is the fact of the thing and the acknowledgement that the fact is real. The SS came to Bastogne believing they were fighting a second-rate army, a rich nation's pampered boys who would fold when the cold came and the ammunition ran out. What they found instead was something that challenged their deepest assumptions about what soldiers could choose to endure. 15,000 American men, most of them in their early 20s, most of them from small towns and middle-class neighborhoods and working-class families, had decided collectively and individually that this was where they were going to be, that this was the place, that these were the people they were going to fight beside, and that whatever came at them from the dark was going to have to deal with that decision. The Germans called it psychologische Immovabilität, psychological immovability. The Americans called it the 101st.